Hey guys, glad to have you here as we enter the next portion of this basic networking course. We're going to be going over some basic switch configuration today. As always, the resources for this can be found in the link in the video description below. I recommend that you download them so you can have all this for your notes, as well as the lab that's at the bottom of this. You can go ahead and attempt that. So to start off, in simple terms, a switch is a device that provides connectivity to devices within a single network. It operates at layer 2 of the OSI model and works primarily with Ethernet frames and MAC addresses. All devices that are connected to the same switch configured for the same network and subnet mask should be able to communicate with each other. Some of the basic things that you'll learn about switches and about Cisco devices in general is there are different command line interface modes. This isn't a comprehensive list, but essentially you'll have user exec mode. From here you can run some basic commands, but there's not a whole bunch of functionality. Then you can move into privileged exec mode. Here you can run any show command, which are commands that display information about your device. And you can also view more detailed information about that device. There's also global configuration mode. This is the base point for all your device configurations. Some configuration commands will be entered in this mode, and then you can also gain access to more specific modes from here. Then there's interface configuration mode. In this mode, just like it sounds, you're going to be configuring the specifics of an interface. And then there's also line configuration mode. It's really similar to interface configuration mode, but it's more for your management access, like console access or SSH or Telnet. So basic navigation in the CLI or command line interface, you're going to start out usually in user exec mode, which is denoted by a caret symbol. To enter privileged exec mode, you're going to type enable and hit enter. You can password restrict this mode, but once you're into privileged exec mode, it's denoted by the pound symbol. To enter global config mode, you're going to type configuration terminal and hit enter. This mode's going to be denoted by the word config. From global config mode, if you type interface followed by the interface that you want to configure, then you'll enter that specific configuration mode. It'll be denoted by the word config-if. From global config mode, if you typed line followed by the line that you want to configure, you'd enter that specific configuration mode, which would be denoted by config-line. And in order to leave the current mode you're in and return to the previous lower mode, you can type the command exit. And in order to return to privileged exec mode from any of the higher modes, you can type the word end. And then if you want to return back to user exec mode, which you probably would not, you can type the word disable. Alright, now that we've gone over some of those basic CLI navigation and modes, we'll head on into some of the other commands that we might be using in this lab. So I just want to point out, it is really important that you know what mode you're in when you're trying to enter commands, because a lot of commands are mode specific, and if you're trying to enter them in the wrong mode, you'll keep getting errors saying that that command isn't recognized, and it might be frustrating because you know it's a command, but you haven't realized that you're not in the right mode for that command. If you're in doubt, type in half your command and then press the tab key, and if it auto completes for you, then you're probably in the right mode for it. But if it says that it's an unrecognized command, then you're probably in the wrong mode for it, and you might want to double check and make sure that you're in the right place. So let's go over these new commands. If I go ahead and enter a switch here, go into the CLI or command line interface, you can see we're going to start out in our user exec mode, which is denoted by that caret. If we type the command enable, we'll go into privileged exec mode. If we type disable, we'd be back in user exec mode. So we want to go ahead and get in there. Exit, like we talked around, would go down one level, and end would go all the way back to privileged exec mode. We might demo that a little later. The tab key would auto-complete a command. If I typed in half of a command and hit tab, you see it auto-completes for me. The question mark is a very powerful command. If we went a little higher and then type in question mark, you can see it'll give us a list of all the possible commands from where we're at. So that'll be something that you'll probably use really often as a beginner in networking. Next, we've got configure terminal, like I just entered above. That gets us in config mode. Here we could do something like enter banner, MOTD, and then we could type a message. This message has to be delimited by 2 like characters that are not in your message itself. So I could start it, say, with a slash and say, hey, this is my message, and end it with a slash, and it would know that everything between those 2 slashes is what I want to make my banner. Also, a host name command that we can change the host name of the device. Let's say I want to change it to my awesome switch. You can see it change the host name right there. We can put a password on the enable mode by saying enable secret. We'll just put our password as Cisco. And so now if we were to exit out, and now we're in user exec mode, if we wanted to get into privileged exec mode, it's going to prompt us for that password. And there we go. We can also make a local account on the device by typing username, let's say Cisco, giving it a password, enter. We can give it a domain name as well, IP domain-name Cisco. The domain's pretty important if you want to generate some cryptographic keys. It needs that to help in that generation. That's our next command, is crypto key generate RSA. You hit enter after this, and then you don't want keys less than 2048. So that's a minimum that you would want to have. And so you see that just generated some cryptographic keys. So if we wanted to enable SSH later, we would be able to do that. Moving over to this side now, we've got some of our interface configuration commands, or line configuration commands. So if we went line console 0 for the console line, now you can see the prompt change to config-line. In here we could specify to prompt for username and password by saying something like login or login local. Login local will use the one of the accounts that you have set up on the device, like we just barely did, but login would just say, I want you to prompt for login on here, but first you're going to have to set a password. So we could say password for just this mode, and then we could say login, and now it will prompt for that password when someone tries to console into the device. If we instead, if we go up one mode, we go into our virtual lines for SSH and Telnet access. Let's say something like 0 to 15, because there's 16 total lines on a switch. In here, we could say login local, and it will use the local account that we created on the device for authentication. We could also say transport input SSH to disable Telnet and require all connections be made through SSH. That command won't work unless you've already generated your cryptographic keys. We go ahead and hop out of this mode. Let's hop all the way back to privileged exec mode. If we do a command like show running config, we'll see right here, we can actually see our password that we sent right here in plain text. But this next command of service password dash encryption, that'll mask that password in the running config for us so that someone can't just pull it open and see what our passwords are. So if we went back into our configuration mode, and then we said service password encryption, and then if we did that show running config command again, now we see the password has been masked. Alright, back into configuration mode. Next command is interface. We could hop into one of the interfaces on the device like G01. And now we're in that specific interface configuration mode. We could give it a description like gig line. And if this was a router, or if we wanted to enable IP addresses on some of these interfaces, we could give it an IP address. but normally you would want to give an IP address to your VLAN interface so that users could connect the device that way to remotely manage it. So if we did interface VLAN1, which is another interface on the device by default, we could go IP address and we could give it an IP address with a subnet mask. Okay. Now the no command, that's going to remove a configuration command that we just specified. So if we went ahead and we did something like show IP interface brief, and I've just abbreviated all those words and Cisco will still recognize it, we can look right here that we set an IP address on that VLAN1 interface. If we go back into that VLAN1 interface and say no IP address 192.168.0.1 and hit enter, and then we should run that command again. Now we look, VLAN1 no longer has an IP address on it. So the no is essentially just the opposite of putting a command in. It'll negate that command if you say no to it. Next is the no shutdown command. That'll essentially enable an interface. So if we go back in to that VLAN1 and we say no shutdown, you see now this has changed the state to up. And we can actually use a trick here and say do to run a command out of its appropriate mode. It only works for a few commands. We could say do show IP interface brief. We can look at that and we can see now VLAN1 has changed its status to up. One more command that we could make on the switch is IP default-gateway and then an IP address. That'll set our default gateway for a switch. That's important if you plan on managing your device remotely from a different network. That way the switch knows where to send traffic back out to which router to be able to get out of the network and back to you. And then our final command that we'll go over is copy running config startup config. If we hop back to privileged exec mode, we can run this command. Essentially what it's doing is saying copy my running config, which is stored in RAM, which would disappear if the device is powered down, to our startup config, which is stored in NVRAM, or something that doesn't disappear when the device is powered down. So it's always important that you save your work when you're done configuring a device, otherwise you might be really surprised when you go back into it if it's had a power cycle or something and it's completely unconfigured. Anyways, those were all our new commands that we'll be going over in the lab that we'll have coming up in the next video. I hope that this helps you as you're trying to learn more about networking. I hope you were able to follow along and it was simple enough. And we'll see you next time.